The air in the tunnel is gone. It has been replaced by a solid, choking soup of dust, cordite, and the coppery scent of fresh blood. Every explosion from above doesn't just shake the rock. It compresses the space, squeezing the life from the men inside. This is not a battle anymore. This is a burial in slow motion. Private Danny Clark's world has shrunk to the vibrations in the stone floor against his cheek. He is pressed against the cold ground, his body a single raw nerve. He is not thinking of glory or country. He is thinking of the cool, sweet water from the pump behind his parents' farmhouse in Ohio. A memory so vivid it is a physical pain. A shell detonates at a tunnel entrance 50 yards away, and the concussion wave rolls through the gallery like a malevolent tide. A piece of timber cracks and falls, crushing a Filipino soldier who had been quietly praying. The man lets out a short, wet sigh and goes still. Danny watches, hypnotized by the sudden stillness of the body just 2 feet from his own. Death is no longer an abstract concept. It is a neighbor, settling in comfortably. Captain John Miller stumbles through the chaos, his boots slipping in a patch of something wet and dark. His command is a ghost. He sees men with 1,000-yard stares, their rifles lying forgotten beside them. He sees a corpsman trying to stuff intestines back into a screaming boy's belly with bare, trembling hands. Miller's own mind, a precise military instrument, is beginning to fracture. He calculates their ammunition, nearly 0. He calculates their water, 2 sips per man, if they are lucky. He calculates the number of able-bodied men who can still hold a perimeter, a number so small it is a mockery. But one calculation he avoids is the most important: the cost of his next order. The weight of it is a cold stone in his gut. In the lateral tunnel serving as an operating room, Lieutenant Sarah Reed operates by the light of a single, guttering lantern. There is no anesthesia. Her patient, a sergeant with a leg shredded by shrapnel, bites down on a leather strap, his eyes wide and bulging. Her hands move with a terrifying, mechanical efficiency. She is not saving the leg. She is racing against gangrene and time she does not have. She saws through bone. The sound is hidden by the shelling. A young medic beside her faints, slumping to the filth-covered floor. Sarah does not pause. She ties off arteries with catgut, her fingers slick with blood. She has performed 17 amputations in 36 hours. She counts them. The numbers are a wall between her and the horror. If she stops counting, the wall will collapse. Leo, the correspondent, crouches behind a crate of empty shell casings. His camera was destroyed a week ago. Now he documents with a pencil in a waterlogged notebook. He writes not for a story, but for proof. 10:47 a.m. direct hit on east entrance. Estimated 30 casualties. The smell is now permanent. Lieutenant Reed's hands are shaking when she thinks no one is looking. Miller is coming apart. You can see it in the way he blinks, too slowly, as if each blink is a tiny surrender. He looks up and sees a soldier, no older than Danny, quietly crying as he holds the hand of his dead friend. Leo writes, "We are not men waiting to die. We are ghosts waiting to be notified." A runner, a boy with a face blackened by smoke, reaches Miller. He does not salute. He just whispers a message, his lips barely moving. Miller's face does not change. It simply empties. All the calculations, all the stubborn resolve, drain away, leaving behind a perfect, hollow acceptance. He looks down the main gallery, at the shattered remnants of his command. He makes a small, sharp gesture to his radio man. The order to surrender is not broadcast. It is passed from man to man in whispers in touches on the shoulder. It travels through the tunnel like a spreading stain. Some men nod, their eyes closing in relief. Others weep silently, their bodies going limp. A few, with a final burst of defiant fury, smash their rifles against the rock walls. They emerge from the hell mouth of the tunnel into the blinding, ironic sunlight. They are a procession of the damned, squinting, shuffling, holding on to each other. The tropical sky is impossibly blue. The ruins of Corregidor smolder around them, a landscape from a dead moon. The Japanese soldiers are a line of crisp khaki and polished steel. They are utterly silent. Their faces show no hatred, no triumph. Only a cold, professional assessment. This silence is more terrifying than any scream. The surrender is systematic, a brutal piece of theater. A Japanese officer, immaculate, steps forward. His boots gleam. He surveys the ragged, filth-caked Americans and Filipinos with an expression of pure disdain. He barks a command. Guards move down the line. They are not searching for weapons. They are erasing identity. Watches are torn from wrists. Wedding bands are ripped from fingers. A soldier clenches his fist around a small silver crucifix. A guard brings his rifle butt down on the man's knuckles. The sound of breaking bone is a sharp, dry snap in the quiet air. The man screams, and the scream is cut short by another blow to the stomach. He folds in half, vomiting into the dust. Danny stands frozen in line. A guard stops in front of him, his eyes impersonal. The guard's hand pats Danny's pockets, finds the small notebook. He flips through the water-blurred sketches of home, the desperate words. He looks at Danny, and for a second, there is a flicker of something. Not understanding, but recognition of this childish vulnerability. Then the guard's face hardens. He methodically tears the notebook in half, and then in half again, letting the pieces flutter to the ground. He moves on. Danny looks at the fragments of his former life in the dirt. His journey from soldier to prisoner is complete. Captain Miller is forced to stand at attention before the Japanese officer. The officer examines Miller's West Point ring. He says nothing. He simply holds out his hand. Miller understands. The last symbol of his honor, his identity, his whole life's path. His hand trembles as he works the ring off his swollen finger. He places it in the officer's gloved palm. The officer closes his fist around it, turns, and walks away. The theft is complete. Sarah is stripped of her medical bag. A guard rummages through it, tossing aside morphine syrettes, bandages, scalpels into the dirt. He keeps the surgical scissors, pocketing them with a grunt. She watches, her face a mask of clinical detachment. But inside, something vital is severed. Her tools, her purpose, are now contraband. They are prodded with bayonets towards the waterfront. Barges wait, their dark holds open like mouths. Leo stumbles, looks back one last time at the tunnel entrance, the grave of the last stand. He has no notebook left. The story is now written on him, in the bruises forming on his skin, in the hollow pit where his courage used to be. As the barge engine coughs to life and pulls away from the rock, the fortress of Corregidor recedes. It does not look like a defeated bastion. It looks like a tombstone. The water is a deep, uncaring blue. The hold they are pushed into is pitch black and stinks of diesel and rot. The engines thrum through the deck, a mechanical heartbeat carrying them into the unknown. The last light of the outside world vanishes as the hatch slams shut with a final, metallic shriek. The darkness is absolute. It is the first true moment of their captivity. The only sounds are the engine, the water against the hull, and the ragged, shared breathing of hundreds of men, trying not to scream. The darkness in the barge's hold was not an absence of light. It was a physical substance, thick, hot, and suffocating. It pressed against the eyes, filled the lungs with the stench of unwashed bodies, vomit, and the sharp, animal smell of pure fear. The air was a finite resource, being rapidly depleted by 200 panicked breaths. The steel deck vibrated with a low, sickening frequency that traveled up the spine and settled in the teeth. Private Danny Clark was curled into a ball, his back against a slimy bulkhead. The initial shock had worn off, leaving a cold, viscous terror in its wake. He could not see the man next to him, but he could feel the man's tremors through the deck plating, a constant, pathetic shudder. Someone was hyperventilating nearby, great gulping sobs that hitched into silence, then started again. A voice, high-pitched and frayed, whispered, "Mama, oh God, Mama," over and over until it was muffled, perhaps by a hand, perhaps by exhaustion. Danny squeezed his eyes shut, but the darkness behind his eyelids was the same. He focused on the vibrations. Each revolution of the propeller was a step further from home, a step deeper into the unknown. He imagined the cool green woods of Ohio, the dappled sunlight on a creek. The memory was so sharp, it was an agony. A man near the center of the hold began to scream, a raw, unfiltered sound of claustrophobic panic. The scream was met with shushes, then curses, then a sickening thud and a gurgle. Silence reclaimed the darkness, more oppressive than before. Danny felt a warm trickle of urine run down his leg. He was too ashamed and too terrified to move. Captain John Miller was trying to create order in the void. He had positioned himself near the hatch, a pointless gesture of leadership. He counted the breaths, timed the distance in his head. The barge was moving slowly, a sitting duck. Every minute was a gift and a curse. He organized the men in his immediate vicinity, not by rank, but by need. A young sailor was rocking back and forth, whispering incoherently. Miller reached out, found the boy's shoulder, and squeezed it firmly, rhythmically, a simple human anchor. "Steady," he murmured, his voice a dry rustle in the dark. "In and out. Just breathe." He was no longer a captain of an army. He was a warden of sanity in a sealed metal coffin. His own mind threatened to spiral into the abyss, the image of his West Point ring in that gloved hand. He pushed it down. He became a machine of assessment. Water. None. Sanitation. None. Morale. Shattered. Objective. Survive the transit. The calculations were bleak, but they filled the terrifying emptiness. Lieutenant Sarah Reed used her professional detachment as a lifeline. She had identified several men with audible wounds by sound alone, the wet, ragged breathing of a punctured lung, the low moan of a broken bone grinding. In the utter blackness, her sense of touch became hyperacute. She moved by feel, her fingers diagnosing in the dark. She found a man with a feverish brow, his pulse fluttering like a trapped bird. Dehydration and infection. She had nothing. Not a drop of water, not a scrap of clean cloth. For the first time in her medical career, her knowledge was a torture device. She knew exactly what was happening inside their bodies, the precise biochemical collapse, and she was powerless to stop it. She tore a strip from the bottom of her own shirt, using it to wipe the brow of the feverish man. It was a meaningless gesture, a ritual, but the act of doing, of pretending to have agency, was the only thread keeping her from screaming. Leo, the correspondent, was cataloging the sounds. the symphony of despair. The weeping, the prayers, the frantic bargaining with God, the sharp arguments over inches of space. He committed it all to memory, his reporter's mind now a grim archive. He thought of his last published article, a flowery piece about the indomitable spirit of the defenders. The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth. The real story was here, in this stinking darkness. It was the sound of a man quietly losing his mind humming a nursery rhyme. It was the vulgar, desperate joke someone told in a hoarse whisper, met with weak, painful chuckles. It was the profound communal silence that followed the joke, as each man retreated back into his private hell. Leo understood now. He was not an observer. He was a specimen, sealed in a jar. Time lost all meaning. It was measured in bladder aches, in cramping muscles, in the creeping dread that the air was running out. The heat became a living thing, a weight pressing down, squeezing sweat from bodies that had no water to spare. Then the engines changed pitch. The vibration slowed. A new sound pierced the gloom. The shouts of guards from above, distant and muffled. A sliver of blinding white-hot light seared into the hold as the hatch was thrown open. Men cried out, shielding their eyes. The fresh air that poured in was tropical, humid, but it felt like ice water after the stew of the hold. Bayonets and shouted orders prodded them up the ladder. The light was a physical assault. Danny stumbled onto the deck, his legs buckling, his vision swimming with white spots. He blinked, gasping. Before him was an island. It was not a barren rock like Corregidor. It was deceptively, cruelly beautiful. Lush green jungle met a ribbon of white sand. Palm trees swayed in a gentle breeze. It looked like a postcard for paradise. The contrast was so profound, it felt like a sadistic joke. This was Baton? A murmur of confused hope passed through the prisoners. Maybe it wouldn't be so bad. Maybe there would be shelter, food. That hope was murdered in the next instant. They were forced into a single, shambling line on the beach. A Japanese officer, different from the one on Corregidor, stood on a small crate. He was flanked by guards with expressionless faces. He did not shout. His voice was calm, precise, and carried the weight of absolute authority. He spoke through an interpreter. The rules were simple, absolute, and delivered like strokes of a lash. The camp was their world. The jungle beyond the wire was death. Attempted escape meant execution for the escapee. And for 10 of his fellow prisoners, selected at random. Look to your left, look to your right. Those are the men who will die for your mistake. Work details were mandatory. Failure to work meant no rations. Sickness was not an excuse. Dropping from exhaustion meant punishment for the entire work detail. All prisoners would bow to any Japanese soldier, regardless of rank. A failure to bow deeply enough was an insult to the emperor. The punishment for insult was severe. There were no other rules. There was no appeal. There was no humanity in the process. This was not a prison system. It was a behavioral experiment in degradation, designed to strip away the last vestiges of civilian morality and military pride. To demonstrate, the officer pointed to a large American sergeant who stood, by ingrained habit, with a posture of defiance. A guard stepped forward. He did not use his rifle. He used a bamboo cane. The first strike was to the back of the sergeant's knees, buckling him. The second, third, fourth strikes landed on his shoulders, his back, with a terrible whistling thwack. The sergeant grunted, trying to stay upright, his face a mask of pain and humiliation. No one moved, no one could. The lesson was being inscribed on all of them. As the beating continued, the prisoners' eyes were forced away from the violence and towards the camp. Through the wire, they saw their future. Men, so thin their uniforms hung like shrouds, moved with the slow, shuffling gait of the utterly exhausted. Their eyes were hollow, sunken into their skulls. They did not look at the new arrivals. They had no curiosity left. They were ghosts in a green hell. The beauty of the island was now the worst kind of lie. The palm trees were sentinels for a graveyard. The white sand was the floor of an antechamber to hell. The paradise was a cage, and the gates were just now swinging shut behind them. The line began to move, prodded forward. They walked from the blinding light of the beach into the dappled, oppressive shade of the camp. The smell here was different from the hold. It was the smell of damp rot, of unchecked human waste, of despair that had seeped into the very soil. They were no longer soldiers, no longer men. They were inventory, logged, processed, and now stored. The fortress of their former selves lay far behind, at the bottom of the sea. All that remained was the fragile, terrified animal within, standing on trembling legs, staring into the heart of the green darkness. The camp was not a place. It was a state of being, a perpetual damp exhaustion that seeped from the mud through the soles of rotting boots and into the soul. The initial shock of the rules on the beach hardened into a daily grinding reality. Survival was no longer a dramatic battle. It was a series of petty, brutal transactions. The first lesson was in geography. The prisoner area was a sea of churned, foul mud, dotted with makeshift shelters, leaning shacks of bamboo and rotting palm fronds that leaked during the daily torrential rains. The Japanese quarters, on a slight rise, were neat wooden buildings. The contrast was a constant visual insult. The jungle was a solid green wall buzzing with insects watching them. The wire fence was not just a barrier. It was the edge of the world. The second lesson was in time. The dawn whistle was not a wake-up call. It was a summons to pain. Work details were assembled under the bored, watchful eyes of the guards. The tasks were Sisyphean. Digging latrine pits that flooded overnight, moving heavy crates of ammunition from one end of the island to the other for no reason, clearing jungle with blunt tools. The purpose was not productivity. The purpose was attrition. Private Danny Clark's first assignment was on the airfield detail. The tropical sun was a hammer on an anvil. Within an hour, his uniform was soaked through with sweat that stung his eyes and left white salt trails on the fabric. His hands, soft from boyhood, blistered, then tore, leaving raw meat on the rough handle of a shovel. The guard overseeing them, a man the prisoners had nicknamed the Heron for his thin, stilt-like legs and sudden stabbing movements, paced slowly. He carried not a rifle, but a length of polished oak. Danny saw an older prisoner, a grizzled Marine, slow for a moment to wipe his brow. The Heron moved with shocking speed. The oak club whipped through the air and connected with the man's kidney with a sickening, dull thump. The Marine dropped without a sound, curling into the mud, gasping like a fish. The Heron stood over him, waiting. After a full minute, the Marine struggled to his knees, then to his feet, his face ashen. He picked up his shovel. He did not look at the guard. He did not look at anyone. He simply resumed digging, his movements now jerky with suppressed agony. Danny looked down at his own blisters and dug faster. Pain was not a reason to stop. It was the environment. The third and most profound lesson was in economy. The official ration was a handful of rancid rice, often crawling with weevils, and a cup of watery broth that smelled of decay. It was a calorie count designed for a slow death. Thus, a black market emerged, an economy of desperation. Cigarettes became gold. A stolen button from a guard's coat could be traded for an extra spoonful of rice. A man's morality became his most liquid asset. Captain John Miller understood systems. He saw the camp not as chaos, but as a brutal ecosystem with its own predators, scavengers, and dying prey. He used the last shreds of his authority to organize not a resistance, but a distribution of misery. He identified the men who were cracking, the ones who stared at the wire for too long, the ones who stopped eating. He paired them with stronger men, not out of compassion, but out of tactical necessity. A collapse of one could trigger punishment for many. He became a broker, negotiating with cynical veterans of earlier captures for scraps of survival lore. Which routes were less poisonous, how to stealthily catch rainwater, which guards could be bribed with a sliver of soap. His leadership was stripped of all glory. It was the administration of decay. At night, in the leaking shack he shared with a dozen others, he would meticulously pick weevils from his rice, counting them. 31, 32. Each tiny, wriggling body represented a fraction of protein. He ate them all. Lieutenant Sarah Reed's hospital was a corner of a barrack floor, demarcated by a line scratched in the dirt. Her supplies were what she could scavenge, steal, or invent. Bandages were torn from shirts, boiled in stolen mess tins over hidden fires. Anesthesia was a piece of leather to bite on, or sometimes just the pressure of Miller's hands on a man's shoulders. The diseases were medieval. Malaria cycled through the men like a vengeful spirit, bringing waves of shaking chills and burning fever that cooked brains. Dengue fever, called breakbone, left strong men weeping from the pain in their joints. Tropical ulcers, starting as a small scratch, would eat down to the bone, filling the air with a sweet, gangrenous stench. Sarah fought a war she could not win. Her greatest enemy was not the guards, but despair. Men would simply give up, turning their face to the wall, refusing their meager rations. She found herself not just healing, but begging, bullying, shaming them into wanting to live. She traded her own bread for a single, precious quinine pill smuggled in by a Filipino laborer, and gave it to a young sailor burning up with fever. She saved his life that night. The next morning, he was beaten for being too slow on a work detail. The calculus was relentless. Leo, the archivist of despair, found his role. He became a scribe. Using a charcoal stolen from a fire and scraps of paper pilfered from the guardhouse trash, he began to record not his feelings but facts, names, dates, the cause of death. Corporal Jenkins died 0500, dysentery, weighed approximately 90 pounds. He drew maps of the camp. He noted guard rotations, the names they gave them, the heron, the bull, the smiler, the most dangerous one. He documented the exchange rate. 1 cigarette equals 2 days' rice ration. He hid the papers in a bamboo pole, creating a cold, factual testimony. He saw Miller's grim pragmatism and Sarah's hopeless triage not as heroism, but as data points in the collapse of civilization. He was chronicling the recipe for turning men into ghosts. The rain came every afternoon. It was a torrential, roaring downpour that turned the camp into a clay bog. It offered a brief, chilling wash, but it also bred mosquitoes and flooded the latrines, spreading filth. Danny, shivering in his shack, watched a rivulet of brown water carve a path through the dirt floor, carrying with it a floating dead cockroach. He stared at it, mesmerized. This was his life now. A slow erosion, carrying away pieces of him he could no longer name. The mud was inside him. It was in his lungs, his gut, his mind. He was no longer an American soldier. He was a creature of the mud, waiting for the rain to wash him away entirely. The line between man and animal had not just been crossed. It had been dissolved by the relentless, soaking damp. The rules were established. The economy was functioning. The slow, steady drawdown of their humanity was now the primary business of Baton. Food ceased to be sustenance. It became an obsession, a religion, a singular point of focus that warped all thought and morality. The gnawing emptiness in the belly was no longer just a physical sensation. It was a new consciousness, a parasite that whispered day and night. The men were no longer prisoners with memories. They were walking, talking, hunger. Private Danny Clark's world telescoped down to the ritual of the meal line. Twice a day, the shuffling queue towards the cook shed was a silent, tense procession. The smell, a vile steam of rotten rice and fish heads, made his stomach cramp with a violence that doubled him over. He would stare at the back of the man in front of him, calculating the precise portion the server might scoop. He developed superstitions. If he stepped with his left foot on a certain knot of wood, the portion might be larger. If he made eye contact with the Korean cook, it might be smaller. The rice in his battered tin cup was a living, moving mass. Weevils, maggots, bits of husk. The old hands ate without looking, shoveling it in fast to trick the mind. Danny tried. He would pick out the largest grubs, the ones visibly pulsing. But as the hunger deepened, his fastidiousness crumbled. One evening, too weak to care, he stared into the gray mash. A fat white larva curled on top. He didn't flick it away. He focused on it. A tiny, obscene piece of protein. He brought the cup to his lips and swallowed everything in 2 convulsive gulps. He felt the larva's passage down his throat, a faint, alien wriggle. He felt no disgust. He felt a grim, cold triumph. He had captured an extra calorie. He had won. The hunger reshaped the body into a grotesque parody. Cheekbones pushed against skin like tent poles. Necks became thin stalks. Uniforms hung like sacks on skeletal frames. But it was the eyes that changed the most. They grew larger, brighter, with a feverish, hollow intelligence, fixed on nothing or on everything, with a predatory sharpness. Captain John Miller now commanded an army of skeletons. His leadership became a brutal form of metabolic management. He caught a man, a former clerk named Peters, stealing an extra handful of rice from the pot of a weaker, delirious prisoner. In the old world, Miller would have had him court-martialed. Here, in the mud, justice was different. Miller didn't strike him. He didn't report him to the guards. That was a death sentence. Instead, he isolated Peters. He used his remaining influence to ensure Peters was last in every line, received the most watery broth, was assigned to the hardest details. It was a slow, silent death sentence administered by the system itself. Miller watched Peters wither, day by day, with the detached focus of a scientist observing an experiment. The message was sent to the others. The collective survival of the group was the only law. Betrayal of the group was a cancer to be excised with cold, ruthless efficiency. Miller's own hunger was a constant, sharp companion. He would dream not of steaks, but of the thick, pasty oatmeal from his academy days. He would wake with his jaws aching from chewing in his sleep. Lieutenant Sarah Reed's medical practice became a study in starvation pathology. The diseases of filth were now compounded by the diseases of absence. Men developed a lethargy so profound they would soil themselves where they lay. Their skin grew dry and scaly. Their hair fell out in clumps. Some developed rice belly, swollen, distended abdomens that jutted out over their stick-like limbs, a cruel joke of malnutrition where fluid leaked into cavities. The most terrifying condition, however, was the one the prisoners called giving up. A man would simply stop. He would sit down, often in a puddle, and refuse to move. His eyes would go vacant. No amount of pleading, threatening, or physical prodding could reignite the spark. These men were the gone. Sarah would diagnose them with a glance. They were already dead. Their bodies just hadn't received the news. She began to triage not by wound, but by will. She would allocate her hidden scraps, a bit of stolen sugar, a piece of dried fruit, not to the sickest, but to those whose eyes still showed a flicker of fight. It was medical heresy. It was camp logic. Leo's documentation took a darker turn. He began to chart the physical decay like an anthropologist. He noted the stages, the constant preoccupation with food, the loss of communal bonds, the rise of feral selfishness, the final descent into apathy. He saw Miller's ruthless pragmatism and understood it as the emergence of a necessary monster, a dark mirror to the guard's cruelty. He saw Sarah's agonizing triage as the logical endpoint of a world without enough. He started a new, secret list, not of the dead, but of the morally compromised. Peters the thief, the men who traded food for favors, the strong who bullied the weak for an extra crust. He was no longer just recording events. He was mapping the dissolution of the human psyche under precise, controlled conditions. His own hunger fueled a cold, clarifying rage. He wanted to remember every fallen benchmark, every tiny surrender. The camp's economy grew more savage. A gold tooth could be traded for 3 days of double rations if you could find a guard willing to arrange its violent extraction. Stories circulated of men disappearing on work details near the jungle's edge, their bodies rumored to have been butchered for meat. No one knew if it was true, but the fact that the story was told and believed was a testament to the new reality. One evening, Danny found a small, half-rotten mango near the perimeter wire, likely tossed aside by a guard. His heart hammered against his ribs. It was the most valuable thing he had ever possessed. He could eat it, secretly, in the night. The sugars would be a shock to his system, a burst of energy. He could trade it for a packet of cigarettes, a currency of power. Or he could give it to the young sailor in Sarah's corner who was fading fast. He crouched in the mud, the fruit clutched to his chest, its sickly sweet smell filling his nostrils. He was not making a moral choice. He was performing a complex calculation of survival, loyalty, and personal gain. All while saliva flooded his mouth so violently he had to swallow again and again. The mango in his hand was no longer fruit, it was a test. And in the green twilight of the camp, as he stared at its mottled skin, Danny Clark could not see a boy from Ohio anymore. He saw a pair of hollow, hungry eyes reflected in the gathering dark. The animal had won. He peeled the skin back with dirty nails and began to eat, quickly, furtively, the juice running through the grime on his chin like tears. The cruelty on Baton was not random. It was a ritual, a deliberate and methodical dismantling of the spirit, designed to prove a philosophical point, that Western civilization was a thin veneer over a helpless animal. This lesson reached its apex in an incident that split time into a before and an after. It began with a misplaced shovel. A simple, blunt tool on the airfield detail had vanished between the end of one work period and the start of the next. The Heron, his face a mask of cold fury, did not ask for the thief. He declared that the entire 20-man detail was responsible for the insult to imperial property. The punishment was called the position. The men were forced to stand at rigid attention in a clearing under the direct vertical sun. They were not to move. They were not to speak. They were not to sway. The Heron and 2 other guards patrolled slowly, bamboo canes in hand. Captain John Miller was in the line. Private Danny Clark was 2 men down. The initial minutes were a test of discipline. Then the sun, a white-hot coin in a metallic sky, began its work. Sweat-stung eyes, dripped off noses, soaked through rags. Flies, drawn to the salt, clustered on lips and eyelids. The first man to sway, a burly Texan weakened by dysentery, took a cane stroke across his shoulders that echoed like a gunshot. He stiffened, a choked gasp escaping him. An hour in, the world began to warp. Danny's vision pulsed with black spots. The green of the jungle swam and vibrated. His knees, locked, began to tremble independently of his will. He focused on a leaf on a tree 20 yards away. He tried to count its veins. The leaf blurred. He bit the inside of his cheek until he tasted blood, using the sharp, coppery pain as an anchor. He could hear the ragged, controlled breathing of the man next to him, a sound like a rusty saw. Miller's mind, his greatest asset, became his torturer. It calculated the dehydration rates, the likelihood of heat stroke, the point of systemic collapse. He forced himself to mentally reconstruct the West Point Cadet Manual, line by line. When that failed, he recited the names of every man in his company who had died on Corregidor. A memorial service in the furnace. He saw the Heron's shadow fall over him. He did not blink. The shadow moved on. The second hour was a descent into a different plane of existence. Muscles screamed in agony, then went numb. The Texan swayed again. A slow, dreamlike tilt. The guards did not strike him immediately. They watched, allowing the hope of recovery, before the Heron delivered a swift, hard blow to the back of his knees. The man collapsed face first into the dirt. He did not get up. He lay there, breathing shallowly. A guard poured a canteen of precious water onto the ground next to his head, the dark stain spreading in the dust, then evaporating in minutes. The psychological cruelty was more devastating than the blow. Danny felt a scream building in his chest, a pressure behind his eyes. He was leaving his body. He was floating above the line of trembling men, looking down at his own gaunt, shining face. He wanted to step forward, to confess to a crime he didn't commit, just to make it stop. Then he locked eyes with Miller. The captain's gaze was not one of encouragement, but of pure, unyielding command. It was a signal fired across a battlefield of pain. You will not break. I am watching. You will not. The third hour broke the first man, not physically, but mentally. A young Navy radio man began to giggle, a high, keening, unhinged sound that bubbled up through the silence. He giggled at the sun, at the guards, at the absurdity of his own torment. The heron stopped in front of him. The giggling turned into open, hysterical laughter. The guard, for the first time, showed a flicker of confusion, then disgust. He jerked his head. 2 guards dragged the laughing man away, towards the camp's punishment hut. His laughter echoed back, long after he was out of sight, a sound more terrifying than any scream. His mind had simply chosen a different exit. As the radio man was dragged away, a miracle occurred. From the direction of the hospital shack, Lieutenant Sarah Reed appeared. She was not allowed on the work site. She carried an empty water bucket, pretending to be on an errand. Her walk took her within 30 feet of the suffering line. She did not look at them. She looked straight ahead, her face impassive. But as she passed, her right hand, hidden from the guard's view by her body, made a small, deliberate motion. A slow closing fist, then an opening of the fingers. A pulse. A heartbeat. You are alive. She did not risk a glance. She continued walking, a figure of impossible dignity in the hellscape. That tiny illegal signal, witnessed by Miller and Danny and a few others, was a lifeline thrown across an abyss. It was not water. It was the assertion that someone still saw them as human. The ordeal ended as abruptly as it began. The heron, bored or satisfied, barked an order. The line was dismissed. Men crumpled where they stood, crawling to the shade, vomiting bile, their bodies seizing with cramps. Miller, using the last of his will, helped drag the unconscious Texan to the shade. His own hands were claws, unable to straighten. That night, in the oppressive darkness, a different kind of resistance was born. It was not the resistance of rebellion, but of preservation. Leo, his fingers still trembling from the ordeal, did not write a factual account. He drew. By the faint glow of a shielded ember, on the back of a stolen requisition form, he sketched the scene. The line of stick-figure men, the looming guard with the cane, the figure of Sarah in the background, her hidden hand a deliberate blur of motion. It was evidence of a different kind, not of what was done to them, but of how they endured it. He hid the drawing deep in his bamboo archive, and Danny, curled in fetal pain, replayed the moment of Sarah's signal over and over. It was a tiny, defiant spark in an ocean of darkness. The guards owned their bodies. They could inflict limitless pain. But that spark, that connection, was a territory they could not conquer. He clutched the memory of it to his chest, a secret treasure more valuable than any rotten mango. The breaking point had been reached, and for some it had revealed not emptiness, but a cold, hard, unbreakable core. The animal could be tortured, but the witness, the silent comrade, the keeper of the spark, that part, they realized with a grim and revolutionary clarity, could not be extinguished as long as one person refused to look away. The line between the living and the dead on Bataan did not exist. It was a porous border, and men crossed it daily, sometimes returning, sometimes not. After the breaking point of the position, a new category of prisoner emerged, more terrifying than the dead: the ghosts. These were men whose bodies still moved, whose lungs still drew breath, but whose internal light, the will that Sarah fought to protect, had been extinguished. They were empty vessels adrift in the mud. Private Danny Clark first saw the ghost in his own reflection. A broken piece of mirror, traded for half a day's rice, showed him a face he did not recognize. The eyes were the worst. They were not his mother's eyes, not the eyes of the boy who had watched for trains back home. They were flat, depthless pools of dull acceptance. He watched his own hand bring rice to his mouth, a mechanical, piston-like motion. He felt nothing. The triumph over the mango was a distant, childish memory. The spark from Sarah's signal was a fading ember in a vast, cold night. He performed his duties. He dug. He carried. He ate. He slept. But the essence of Danny Clark was retreating, hibernating deep within the skeletal cage of his body, leaving a hollow shell to navigate the horror. He was becoming a ghost in training. The camp's atmosphere changed. The frantic, desperate energy of early survival gave way to a low, mournful hum of resignation. The sounds were different now, less arguing, fewer sobs. Just the constant wet coughs of sick men, the shuffle of feet without purpose, the low buzz of flies over the latrine trenches. Men stopped talking about home. Memories of a world before the wire became painful, disorienting fantasies. To remember a warm bed was to physically ache. It was easier to forget. Captain John Miller now commanded a company of specters. His leadership shifted from brutal metabolic management to a grim kind of shepherding. He was not leading men to an objective, but preventing them from wandering off a psychic cliff. He instituted a new, simple rule: no man would die alone. It was a logistical order, not a compassionate one. A man dying alone was a data point for the guards, a number easily erased. A man dying witnessed, his name spoken, was a piece of evidence. Miller would station the strongest of the ghosts, men who were emotionally numb but physically functional, beside the dying. Their only task was to note the time, and if possible, the name. Miller would then relay this information to Leo, the archivist. It was a factory of death, with a quality control checklist. Miller himself felt the pull of the ghost state. It was a seductive, quiet peace. To stop caring, to stop calculating, to let the tide of misery wash over him without resistance. He fought it by sharpening his focus to a razor's edge, micromanaging the decay, making the administration of extinction his reason for being. Lieutenant Sarah Reed's hospital corner became the antechamber for ghosts. The diseases had merged into a single, systemic collapse. Men lay in rows, many silent, staring at the bamboo ceiling. The will to live was now a clinical symptom, as measurable as a fever. She saw Danny on a work detail, moving with the slow, precise gait of a sleepwalker. She recognized the signs. It was a different malady, one her medicines could not touch. Her thefts from the guards became more audacious, not for quinine, but for stimuli. A pinch of stolen salt to shock a palate, a fiercely bright flower stolen from outside the wire, placed where a dying man could see it. She once spent a whole day secretly dripping precious water into the mouth of a comatose man. Not because she believed he would live, but because she refused to let the act of care itself become a ghost. Her hands, which had trembled, were now steady as stone. The cost of that steadiness was a profound inner coldness. Leo's documentation project faced its greatest challenge. How do you record the absence of a thing? He began noting not just deaths, but disappearances. Private First Class Henderson, eyes open, does not respond, fed by spoon, a ghost as of 1400. He started a second list, a ledger of the vanished selves. He interviewed the fading men, not about the camp, but about the world before. He asked about the smell of a bakery, the color of a girlfriend's dress, the sound of a particular radio show. He wrote these fragments down, preserving not their dying, but their living memories. He was building an ark for ghosts, storing their humanity in his bamboo poles. He realized Miller's rule, "No man dies alone," was not just about witnessing death. It was about forcing a living witness to remain engaged, to resist the comforting pull of ghosthood. Leo, by listening, by writing, was that witness. The cold rage in him now had a purpose: to be the memory the ghosts had lost. The guard's behavior shifted in response to this new phase. The random explosive violence decreased. It was replaced by a colder, more contemptuous disregard. They called the slow-moving prisoners zombies. They would trip them for sport, laughing as they fell face first into the mud, then walking away as the figure struggled to rise, a slow, pathetic insect. The cruelty was no longer about breaking spirit. It was an amusement with broken toys. The defining moment of the ghost chapter came with the monsoons. Torrential rains fell for days, turning the camp into a shallow brown lake. The latrines overflowed, spreading a slick of human filth through the sleeping areas. In the middle of the night, a mudslide collapsed one wall of a barracks. Danny was there, half submerged in the cold, filthy water. In the chaos and the screaming dark, he saw a ghost in action. An older prisoner, a man who had not spoken in weeks, was pinned under a fallen roof beam, water rising over his chest. His face was calm. He made no sound. Another prisoner, a man still clinging to his fire, was screaming, trying to lift the beam, his back straining. The ghost looked at the struggling man, then looked at the rising water covering his chin. He did not struggle. He simply exhaled, a long, slow sigh of release, and allowed the water to take him. He chose to become a true ghost. The rescuer, feeling the life go out of the pinned man, stopped screaming. He stood in the rising water, his fight gone. By morning, he too had the empty eyes. Danny, shivering in the aftermath, understood the choice. It was easier to sink, to let the mud inside finally claim the last hollow space. The ghost state was not a punishment. It was an offer, a quiet end without the drama of death. As he helped bail putrid water from his shack, his movements automatic, he felt himself hovering at the threshold. The memory of his own face in the mirror merged with the face of the drowned man. He was a ghost. But somewhere, deep in the flooded cellar of his being, a part of Danny Clark was still awake, watching the water rise, and deciding, moment by terrible moment, not to sigh. Not yet. The war was no longer against the guards, or hunger, or disease. It was a silent, invisible war against the lure of nothingness. And they were all losing, one soul at a time. It began not with a shout, but with a whisper. A rumor was a fragile, dangerous thing in a place where hope was a pathogen more deadly than cholera. It arrived not on a radio wave, but carried in the eyes of a new guard, one with less cruelty and more nervousness in his posture. It was hidden in the slight, almost imperceptible reduction in the severity of the beatings, as if the captors were conserving their energy for a different fight. It was tasted in the rice, which contained marginally fewer maggots, a subtle shift in the calculus of neglect that spoke of a distracted administration. The rumor was this: the Americans were coming back. It did not arrive whole. It was a phantom assembled from fragments. A work detail near the coast heard a distant, deep-throated rumble one afternoon, a sound that was not thunder. The guards had looked at the sky, not with boredom, but with a sharp, wary tension. A Korean laborer, risking a glance at a prisoner he sometimes traded with, tapped his ear and then pointed far out to sea, his expression unreadable. A stolen Japanese newspaper fragment, used as wrapper for a fish head, showed a map with arrows that did not point towards defeat, but towards a slow, grinding advance through islands with unfamiliar names. The rumor infected the camp not with joy, but with a terrifying, seismic disruption. For men who had made peace with death, who had become ghosts, the possibility of a future was a violent shock to the system. Private Danny Clark felt it as a physical pain. The carefully constructed numbness that protected him cracked. The thought of a world beyond the wire, of his mother's face, of a soft bed, was no longer a nostalgic fantasy. It was a taunting, possible reality. The pain was acute, a yearning so intense it felt like a fist squeezing his heart. He found himself looking at the jungle wall, not as a boundary, but as a veil that might soon be torn. He started counting days again, something he had stopped doing months ago. The ghost was reawakening into a man, and the process was excruciating. Every sunset was no longer just another survived day. It was a countdown. And with that countdown came a new, paralyzing fear. To die now, on the eve of salvation, would be the ultimate cosmic joke. The hunger in his belly was suddenly joined by a more desperate hunger, the need to witness the end. Captain John Miller's analytical mind, which had been focused solely on managing decline, now pivoted to a new, infinitely more complex calculation. Survival in the endgame. He understood the most dangerous period for any prisoner is just before liberation. A cornered enemy is at its most vicious and unpredictable. The rumors of advance could trigger a massacre to erase evidence. His leadership transformed overnight from shepherding ghosts to preparing soldiers for one final, invisible battle. The battle to stay alive, long enough to be found. He began a covert campaign of life enforcement. He redistributed hidden caches of stolen vitamins, not to the strongest, but to the weakest, who still had a flicker behind their eyes. He orchestrated a slowdown on work details, not a defiant strike, but a calculated, plausible erosion of productivity, conserving precious calories. He spread a new, silent directive. Look down. Show no excitement. Be more ghost-like than ever. The rumor demanded the greatest acting performance of their lives. Any spark of hope in their eyes could be a death sentence. Lieutenant Sarah Reed saw the rumor's impact in her hospital corner. Men who had been waiting to die now began to fight their infections with a desperate, clawing tenacity. A sailor with a festering leg ulcer, who had been passive for weeks, now begged her to cut deeper, to do anything to stop the rot. The will to live, once a symptom, was now a raging fever. But medicine had run out. Her store of stolen supplies was a barren cupboard. She performed surgeries with a sharpened spoon, her hands steady, but her soul in torment. Saving a life now felt like a direct, furious act of defiance against the entire island. Every man who breathed when the liberators came would be a living indictment. She worked until she collapsed, driven by a new, terrifying deadline. Leo, the archivist, faced a crisis of purpose. His meticulous records of death were now potentially the most dangerous objects in the camp. If discovered, they would be a direct trigger for their execution. But they were also the ultimate proof. He spent a frantic, secret night revising his hiding places, separating the lists, waterproofing them in stolen oilcloth. He began a final urgent project, a master list, not of the dead, but of the living. He took a census, moving furtively from shack to shack, confirming names, ranks, home states. This list was not for history. It was for the world outside. It was a receipt. These are the men you left here. These are the ones who remain. Acknowledge us. The cold rage in him finally found its target, not just the guards, but the forgetting that would surely follow. His records would be a bulwark against amnesia. The camp's atmosphere became a volatile, silent, electric field. The guards felt it too. Their discipline tightened, but a new anxiety flickered beneath their stern masks. The smiler, the most feared guard, stopped smiling. His beatings became more perfunctory, his eyes darting more often to the horizon. The prisoners and their captors were now locked in a silent, deadly waiting game, both listening to the same distant thunder, both knowing the status quo was crumbling. Then, the first concrete evidence arrived. A work detail on a salvage mission near a communications shack saw it. A single American aircraft, high and silver, contrailing across the sky. It was not a bomber. It was a reconnaissance plane, a silent, gleaming scout. It made no aggressive move. It simply existed, a slash of modernity in the primitive sky. No one pointed, no one cheered. Every man on that detail froze in place, their heads bowed, their hands trembling on their tools. But inside, a silent detonation occurred. The rumor was now a fact. The world had not forgotten them. It was coming. That night, in the absolute darkness of the barracks, the silence was different. It was not the silence of despair or of ghosts. It was the thick, humming silence of a coiled spring. Men lay awake, staring into the black, listening to the jungle sounds and imagining they heard the deep, reassuring thrum of ship engines over the horizon. The fear was sharper than ever. The hope was more painful than any beating. They were balanced on a knife edge between a hell they knew and a salvation that might still kill them. The island of Bataan was no longer just a prison. It was a time bomb, and the fuse was burning down in the hearts of every man who dared, once more, to dream of home. The end did not come with a bang. It came with a silence so profound, it was itself a sound. One morning, the dawn whistle did not blow. The absence of that shrill, hated noise was more startling than any explosion. The men emerged from their shacks, blinking in the gray dawn light, into a world stripped of its malignant rhythm. The guard towers were empty. The main gate to the Japanese compound stood open, swinging slightly in the breeze. The camp was abandoned by its masters. The void they left behind was more terrifying than their presence. It was a vacuum filled with 1,000 frantic, screaming questions. Was it a trick? A final sadistic trap? Were they mined? Were snipers waiting in the jungle? Captain John Miller immediately assumed command of the silence. He moved with a speed that seemed impossible for his emaciated frame, issuing sharp, whispered orders that cut through the paralyzing confusion. He formed scouts, men who could still run, or at least shuffle quickly. Their orders were not to explore but to observe, to watch the tree line, the road, the beach, to report any movement. He posted sentries at the empty guard posts, not to keep anyone in, but to guard against whatever came next. He was a general without an army, securing territory in a world that had just lost all its rules. Private Danny Clark stood in the center of the compound, turning in a slow circle. The silence was a physical pressure in his ears. He could hear the rustle of the palms, the distant cry of a bird, the ragged sound of his own breathing, the weight of the sky, without the threat of a beating beneath it, felt immense and crushing. He looked at the open gate. For over a year, that gate had been the boundary of the universe. Now it was just a hole in some bamboo. He took a step towards it, then another. His legs, used to the weight of fear, felt impossibly light, unstable. He reached the gate. He put a trembling, skeletal hand on the rough bamboo post. He did not cross. He simply stood on the threshold, 1 foot in the hell he knew, 1 foot in the unknown green beyond, and he wept. Not with joy, but with a total overwhelming confusion. He had no self left to guide him out. The camp descended into a fragile, surreal autonomy. Some men, driven by a final desperate hunger, looted the Japanese storehouse. They found bags of clean rice, tins of fish, real medicine. They fell upon it like animals, gorging until they vomited, their shrunken stomachs rebelling against the shock of plenty. Miller did not stop them. He knew some would die from this. It was a choice between one kind of death and another. He focused on securing the water supply. Lieutenant Sarah Reed's hospital became a true crisis zone. The sudden abundance of food and medicine was a cruel mockery. Men who had clung to life through sheer grim willpower now began to die, their systems collapsing under the shock of hope. She moved among them, injecting stolen vitamins, forcing clean water between cracked lips, her voice a constant hoarse mantra. "Hold on, just a little longer. They are coming. You have to see it." She was no longer fighting disease. She was fighting the cruel inertia of the body, which had calibrated itself to a slow extinction and could not recalibrate fast enough. Leo did not join the looting or the vigil. He went to work. This was the final entry. He retrieved every hidden scrap of his archive from its bamboo crypts. He laid the lists, the dead, the living, the moral compromises, the sketches of the position on a clean blanket in the middle of the compound. He weighed them down with stones against the breeze. He was preparing evidence for the tribunal he knew must come. He sat cross-legged beside his life's work, a scribe awaiting the final reader. Then the sound came. Not from the jungle, but from the sea. A deep, resonant, diesel thrumming that grew in the air until it vibrated in their chests. It was the sound of massive ships. Men stumbled from shacks, from the storehouse, their mouths full of stolen food, and turned as one towards the coast. On the beach, they gathered, a ragged, silent congregation of skeletons in tattered rags. They watched as the shapes appeared on the horizon. Gray, beautiful, monstrous shapes of warships. Smaller boats detached and began to carve white lines in the blue water towards them. The first American reconnaissance boat approached the shore with caution, weapons trained on the beach. The soldiers aboard saw a scene from a medieval plague pit. Figures that were barely human, standing or sitting in the sand, their eyes huge in skull-like faces. There was no cheering, no waving, just a profound, watchful silence. A young naval lieutenant jumped into the shallow surf, his uniform crisp and clean, his face full of a righteous, prepared anger that immediately evaporated into horrified disbelief. He walked up the sand, his boots leaving perfect prints, and stopped before the gathered prisoners. He looked from face to face, his own expression crumbling. He opened his mouth to speak, to say, "We're here," or "You're safe," but no words came out. The language of the world he came from had no vocabulary for this. It was Captain Miller who broke the silence. He took one stiff, painful step forward. He did not salute. His body was incapable of that formal rigidity. Instead, he drew himself up to his full, reduced height. His voice, when it came, was a dry rasp, but it carried clearly on the salt air. "United States Forces, Captain John Miller reporting," he said. Then, with a terrible bureaucratic precision born of 1,000 nights of mental record-keeping, he added, "The surviving personnel of Corregidor. I have a manifest." He gestured a bony hand towards Leo, who remained sitting beside his papers on the bluff above. The young naval lieutenant followed the gesture, seeing the man and the strange, paper-strewn blanket. The lieutenant's eyes welled with tears he could not explain. This was not the liberation he had imagined. The beach then became a blur of gentle chaos. Medics moved among them, speaking in soft, shocked tones. Blankets were offered. Some men accepted them. Others simply stared at the clean, pink faces of their rescuers, as if they were aliens. Danny Clark let a medic wrap him in a blanket. The wool was scratchy, alien. He accepted a bar of chocolate. He stared at it, unwrapped it, and took a small bite. The sweetness was so violent, so cloying and overwhelming, that it triggered a gag reflex. He spit the brown paste into the white sand. He looked back at the camp. From the sea, with the green jungle behind it, it almost looked picturesque. He could see the roof of the shack where he had lived. He could see the exact spot where he had eaten the mango. He could see the clearing where they had stood for the position. He turned away and looked at the vast, empty horizon. On the bluff, Leo watched as a senior officer, his face grave, approached him and knelt by the blanket of papers. The officer picked up a page, the sketch of the line of men under the sun. His hand began to shake. He looked at Leo. Leo simply nodded once and then looked back out to sea, his work done. The ships loomed larger, waiting to take them away. The weight of the light, of freedom, of a future they had forgotten how to conceive, was now their final and most bewildering burden. They were leaving the island of ghosts, but as they were helped gently into the landing craft, not one of them looked back with triumph. They looked back with the hollow eyes of witnesses, carrying a silent, terrible country within them that they would now have to learn to describe, in a world that would never, ever, truly understand. The gates of hell were behind them. The long journey home into a different kind of silence had just begun.